ever get that feeling? Like you really want to grasp something complex to understand it at a deep level, without getting bogged down for weeks in research papers.
Yeah, totally.
Well, that's precisely what we do here on the Deep Dive. We handle all the digging so you don't have to, and we bring you the core insights from the research in a way that's actually engaging.
And today's journey is particularly interesting. We've been exploring some really cutting-edge research that outlines the path forward for a really ambitious project. It's about building a comprehensive, data-driven model of how sound is processed in the brain, specifically the auditory circuits in a macaque monkey.
All right, so for everyone listening, picture this. A team of scientists has built this incredibly detailed computer simulation of a brain. We're talking about key areas of the auditory system, like the primary auditory cortex, A1, and a relay station in the thalamus called the medial geniculate body, or MGB for short, and even another area called the thalamic reticular nucleus, or TRN, which acts like a control center.
Mm-hmm.
And here's the thing, it's not just based on theory. This model is rigorously tested against tons of real experimental data.
That's exactly right. This initial model is a remarkable achievement in itself. You can think of it like this. The model can simulate the electrical activity of individual brain cells, so their voltage fluctuations, their firing patterns, and it goes even further. It can mimic larger-scale brain waves that we measure with things like LFPs, CSD, even EEG. And what's truly impressive is that it spontaneously generates rhythmic brain activity oscillations across different frequencies, just like we see in actual macaque brains.
It's mind-blowing when you really stop and think about it. I mean, it's not just a static picture. This thing is actually behaving like a real brain, even predicting some of the mechanisms behind these complex brain rhythms. So we have this foundational model, and it's incredible. But what's next? What is this path forward the research talks about?
Well, the researchers have laid out these exciting steps for how they're going to take this model to the next level. And what we're going to do today is unpack the key enhancements they are proposing. But more importantly, we're going to explore what these advancements could mean for our understanding of how we hear and process sound. It's like a sneak peek into the future of auditory neuroscience, and you're coming along for the ride.
Sounds like a plan. Let's dive in. The first stop on this path forward is something called short-term synaptic plasticity. We'll call it STP for short. Now, for those of us who aren't neuroscientists, what exactly does STP mean?
Imagine the connections between brain cells, the synapses, as communication junctions. Okay. STP is the ability of these junctions to change their strength, but temporarily, based on how much they've been used recently and how often. And it's like a volume knob, almost, turning it up or down, depending on the situation.
Got it.
So there are two main types of STP. We have facilitation, which is like, if you've been using a muscle, it gets stronger for a bit. And then we have depression, which is kind of like a muscle getting tired after you've used it for a while.
Ah, okay, that makes sense. So the connection gets stronger with facilitation and weaker with depression.
Exactly.
And I read that there's already a bunch of data out there about these STP effects. They even have a whole database for it, right? The Neocortical Microcircuit Collaboration Portal.
That's right, they do.
So with all this data already out there, how would adding STP into the macaque model actually change things?
Well, the exciting thing here is that with STP, the model could actually start showing more natural behavior.
Mm-hmm.
Like our brains adapt to sounds. Think about it. A really loud, sudden noise might make you jump at first.
Oh, yeah.
But then you get used to it pretty quickly.
Right.
You become less sensitive to it. It's called adaptation. And right now, to make the model do that, they'd have to adjust things manually. But with STP built in, the changing strength of the synapses could make the model adjust itself, automatically changing its own firing rates and how it responds over time. Like the model having its own built-in adaptation mechanism.
Oh, wow. That sounds like a big step. And they even suggest an experiment to see how this would work, right?
Yeah, they do.
Something about comparing the network's reaction to noise with and without STP.
Exactly. So they could directly measure how much STP actually contributes to the adaptation we see in real brains. It's like figuring out how important that synaptic volume knob really is for processing sound over time.
Makes sense. Now, you said adding STP increases the parameter space, right? Basically the number of things they need to adjust in the model.
Yeah.
Wouldn't that make it way harder to get everything working properly? I mean, more parameters, more complexity, right?
It definitely does. More parameters mean there are more moving parts to adjust and get just right. It becomes a much harder puzzle to solve to make sure the model behaves realistically. It's kind of like you were trying to tune a piano, but instead of 88 keys, you had thousands.
That sounds tough.
Yeah, it's a big challenge. And That's exactly why the researchers also highlight how important it is to develop new computational methods, better tools to handle this increased complexity. Think of it as needing smarter algorithms and more powerful computers to tune that massive piano.
Yeah, I can see that. All right, so moving on, the next thing on the path forward is dendritic and network nonlinearities. Now, the current model already includes these really detailed neuron shapes, which is super impressive. Where can they go from there to make it even more realistic?
So think of it this way. They're looking to add finer details within the neurons themselves, like zoom in even further. One area they're looking at is the distribution of ion channels along the dendrites.
Okay, back up for a second. What are dendrites again? And ion channels.
Oh, right. So dendrites are like the branches of a neuron. They receive signals from other neurons. And ion channels are these tiny gates on the dendrites that control the flow of electrical signals.
Okay, got it.
So where these channels are and how many there are can change how the neuron processes the incoming information. They are also thinking about incorporating gap junctions between interneurons. These are special connections that allow for very fast communication between certain types of brain cells. Imagine it like upgrading the wiring within each part of the circuit, making it more precise, more nuanced.
So we're essentially talking about making each individual neuron more complex, right?
That's right.
But how would those tiny details within each neuron affect the whole network?
Well, these finer dendritic processes, things like active backpropagation, where signals can travel backward along those branches, and dendritic spikes, little electrical bursts within the branches themselves. They can drastically change how a neuron responds to the signals it's getting. And this, in turn, can affect when it fires, how strong the signal is, and basically reshape the entire network's activity. So each neuron is becoming more like a powerful mini-computer.
Fascinating. And there's an experiment they mention here, too, something about gamma waves.
Yeah, they want to understand how these dendritic processes might be involved in generating gamma waves, which are thought to be really important for lots of cognitive functions. For example, they're looking at how a specific type of dendritic event, called an NMDA spike, might play a role. So imagine they slowly add these features to the model and then see how it changes the gamma waves. It's like fine-tuning an instrument to get the perfect sound.
Okay, so next up. They emphasize the importance of targeted data acquisition in macaque A1. What exactly do they mean by targeted? Like, what's missing?
You see, as amazing as the model is, there's still a lot we don't know about the specifics of the macaque auditory system. It's like having a map with some blank spots.
Oh, I see.
So they've had to use data from other animals, like rodents and cats, even humans sometimes, to fill in those gaps. It gets them close, but to make the model really accurate, they need more data directly from macaques.
Makes sense. So they want to get more detailed information about how macaque neurons actually behave when they're processing sounds.
Exactly. They specifically talk about using advanced techniques like calcium imaging and justicellular recordings, which let them measure the activity of individual neurons while the macaque is awake and actually listening to sounds. It's like listening in on the brain's conversations in real time.
Wow. And they also want to map the connections between different types of neurons.
That's right. They want to know how likely it is that one type of neuron will connect to another type. That would give them the exact wiring diagram of the circuit, like a blueprint for how everything's connected.
And they specifically highlight how the model is open source. What does that mean for all this new data they want to get?
Well, it means that as soon as new research is published with these macaque-specific details, they can update the model immediately. No waiting around. It makes the whole process much faster and keeps the model at the cutting edge of what we know. It's constantly evolving and becoming more accurate.
That's amazing. And, they mentioned the Brain Initiative's Cell Census project. How would that help with refining the model?
Oh, the Cell Census project. That's a huge undertaking. It's like a massive inventory of all the different types of brain cells, not just in the auditory cortex, but in the whole primate brain. Imagine they're going to map out where each cell type is, how many there are, and even what they look like.
Wow, so that would give them an even more precise picture of what the macaque auditory cortex is actually composed of.
Precisely. It would allow them to make the model's cell populations much more accurate. It's like going from a rough sketch to a high-definition image.
Cool. And they mentioned something about validating the model at multiple scales. What does that mean exactly?
So it's tough to get detailed information at the single cell level from a living macaque brain.
Yeah, I can imagine.
Right. So they want to find other ways to confirm that the model is accurate. And one way to do that is to compare the model's output to larger scale brain activity that's easier to measure. Things like EEG.
Ah, so looking at those bigger brainwaves as a way to see if the model is on the right track.
Exactly. Right now, they can generate simulated EEG, but they want to compare it to actual EEG data from macaques. If the model's EEG matches what they see in real brains, it's a sign that the model's internal workings are probably accurate too. It's kind of like if you build a car engine and it sounds just like a real engine, that's a pretty good indication that you put it together correctly.
That's a good analogy. So multiscale validation is all about making sure the model is consistent with what we see at different levels of the brain.
Exactly. From tiny ion channels to large-scale brain waves.
Okay, on to the next big challenge. Parameter tuning and scalability. It's mind-boggling to think that this model has 25 million synapses. That's a lot of variables to optimize.
It really is a massive undertaking. Imagine trying to adjust 25 million knobs to get just the right sound out of an instrument.
Oh man, talk about a headache.
Right. So finding the exact combination of values for all those synapses to make the model accurately mimic a macaque brain is a huge challenge.
Yeah, it's almost unfathomable.
The researchers propose a kind of divide and conquer strategy to manage all that complexity.
They mentioned that they've already done something similar before, right?
Yeah, they've used a layer-by-layer tuning approach in the past, and they want to build on that. Basically, they'll break down the problem into smaller, more manageable chunks. For example, they might start by optimizing the parameters for just the connections within the cortex itself, then separately tune the connections from the thalamus to the cortex, and finally fine-tune everything together. It's like building a complex machine in stages, making sure each part works correctly before assembling the whole thing.
So breaking it down into smaller pieces makes it easier to see what's affecting what.
Right. It helps them isolate which parameters are doing what. It can also help them figure out if there are multiple solutions that work equally well for a specific part of the system.
Interesting. So you might have different ways to tune the cortex that all lead to the same outcome. But then when you add the thalamus, it might become clear which of those solutions is the most biologically realistic.
Exactly. It helps them narrow down the possibilities and find the most accurate set of parameters.
Makes sense. And they also talk about leveraging machine learning surrogates. What exactly are those and how could they help?
So imagine you have a machine learning model, like a neural network, that can learn the relationship between all those parameters and how the model behaves.
Okay.
So it can predict what the model's output will be based on how you adjust those parameters. It's like a shortcut. You don't have to run the full computationally expensive simulation every time you want to test something.
Wow, that's smart. So you're using AI to help you understand this complex biological model.
Exactly. And what's even cooler is that you could potentially use this machine learning surrogate for real-time model fitting.
What does that mean?
So as you're collecting new experimental data, you can use the surrogate model to quickly adjust the parameters in real time, trying to find the best match to the data you're seeing. It's a dynamic and data-driven way to refine the model.
It's amazing how much AI is changing scientific research.
It really is. And in this case, it's essential. I mean, they mentioned that the original optimization process took 500,000 simulations. That's a huge amount of computing power. And as the model gets more complex, they need even more efficient methods to keep up.
Makes sense. So the next big hurdle is scaling to multiple cortical columns. Right now, the model simulates a single column. Why do they want to expand to multiple columns?
Well, a lot of the really complex stuff that our brains do, like distinguishing different frequencies or understanding speech, probably involve multiple columns working together.
Right. It's not just one isolated area doing all the work.
Exactly. So to really capture those higher level functions, they need to expand the model to include multiple interacting columns.
But that would be a huge computational leap, wouldn't it?
Oh, absolutely. More columns mean more neurons, more synapses, more computations. It's a big challenge. They talk about using supercomputers and parallel processing to handle the load, but managing all that data and communication between processors is not easy.
It's complicated.
It is. That's why they want to start with some pilot simulations, maybe just 2 columns connected, to see how well it scales and what the challenges are. It's like a test run before attempting the full marathon.
Okay, that's a good approach. So finally, they talk about the ongoing need for performance optimization and the use of surrogate modeling. These seem to be recurring themes throughout the whole path forward.
Yeah, they are really central to the whole project. As the model gets bigger and more complex, they need to keep making the simulations faster and more efficient. And the surrogate models are a crucial part of that. They provide a way to explore different parameters and get quick feedback without having to run the full, detailed simulation every time.
So it's about constantly improving the tools and the methods to keep pace with the model's growing complexity.
That's it, exactly.
All right, let's move on to the potential applications and frontier concepts that this research could unlock. And the first one is real-time capability. Why is that so important for future applications?
Well, think about things like brain-computer interfaces or controlling robotic limbs. For those applications, the model needs to be able to process information and respond in real time, just like a real brain. If it takes too long, it's just not practical.
Makes sense. So it's about speed.
Yeah. And they propose a two-tiered approach to achieve that. They'll keep developing the detailed, biologically accurate model, but they'll also develop a simplified version of the model that can run in real time.
Ah, so it's like having a high-fidelity version and a streamlined version.
Exactly. The detailed model is the gold standard for understanding the underlying biology and for making sure the simplified version is accurate. But the simplified version is what would actually be used in real-time applications.
Makes sense. Now on to the next fascinating area. Multiscale emergent dynamics and nested oscillations. The current model already shows different brainwave frequencies coexisting. Where do they want to go from there?
Well, they want to understand how these different rhythms interact with each other, a phenomenon called cross-frequency coupling.
Cross-frequency what?
Coupling. It's like different rhythms influencing each other, almost like a musical duet.
Oh, okay.
They specifically mention how slower brainwaves, like theta oscillations, might be modulating faster rhythms, like gamma, during things like speech processing.
Yeah.
It's like the slower rhythm is setting the tempo for the faster one.
That's a great way to think about it. And to capture these more complex interactions, they're talking about adding new mechanisms to the model.
Exactly. Things like inhibitory feedback loops between different groups of neurons. It's like adding more layers of complexity to the orchestra.
And this gets us closer to understanding how real brains process information, right?
Exactly. It's all about making the model more and more biologically realistic.
Okay, so next up, astrocytes and non-neuronal dynamics. We've been talking a lot about neurons, but astrocytes are a different type of brain cell altogether, right?
Yeah, they are. They're a type of glial cell, which were once thought to just be support cells. But we're learning that they play a much more active role in how the brain works.
Oh, really?
They can actually influence how neurons communicate with each other, even how whole networks of neurons behave. And the researchers want to start incorporating astrocytes into the model.
Wow, that's pretty cutting edge. Why is that important?
Well, astrocytes can do things like regulate the levels of certain chemicals around neurons, which can affect how excitable those neurons are. And they're also involved in cleaning up waste products and providing nutrients. It's like they're the caretakers of the brain. So by adding them to the model, we can start to see how those factors might influence things like auditory processing.
It's like adding another layer of biological realism to the model.
That's exactly right. It's taking us closer to understanding how the whole brain works, not just the neurons.
Okay, now let's talk about some specific applications. First up, adaptive auditory brain-computer interfaces. Those sound pretty futuristic. How would this research contribute to that field?
Brain-computer interfaces, or BCIs, are all about allowing people to control devices or communicate using their brain activity. And for people who are severely paralyzed or have lost the ability to speak, BCIs could be life-changing.
Yeah, I've seen some amazing videos about that.
So how this model can help is by giving us a deeper understanding of how the auditory cortex processes information, especially things like attention and selective listening. Imagine a BCI that could decode those signals and allow someone to communicate just by focusing their attention on different sounds.
Wow, that would be incredible. So the model could essentially be trained to recognize different patterns of brain activity that correspond to different thoughts or intentions.
That's right. It would be like a translator between the brain and the computer.
That's amazing. And building on that idea, they also talk about therapeutic stimulation devices for conditions like tinnitus. How would that work?
Tinnitus is a condition where people hear a ringing or buzzing sound in their ears, even though there's no actual external sound.
Oh, I've heard about that.
Yeah, it can be really debilitating.
Yeah.
And it's thought to be caused by abnormal activity in the auditory cortex. So the idea here is to use the model to first identify those abnormal patterns of activity and then to design brain stimulation therapies to try to correct them.
It's like using the model to figure out what's wrong and then to engineer a way to fix it.
Exactly. It could be a game changer for people suffering from tinnitus.
Okay, on to the next application. Neuromorphic hardware implementation for speech recognition. Neuromorphic hardware, that sounds pretty technical.
Yeah, it's basically a new type of computer chip that's designed to work more like a real brain.
Okay, so instead of traditional computers, we're talking about brain-inspired chips.
That's right. And the idea is to implement this auditory model onto these neuromorphic chips to create new, more efficient, and more accurate speech recognition systems.
What advantages would that offer compared to current speech recognition technology?
Well, brains are incredibly good at filtering out noise and focusing on the important sounds. So a neuromorphic speech recognition system might be much better at understanding speech in noisy environments. It could also be more sensitive to things like the rhythm and timing of speech, which are important for understanding meaning.
That's really interesting. So it's about mimicking the way our brains process sound to create more human-like speech recognition systems.
Precisely. And there's already research showing that spiking neural networks, like the ones in this model, can be used for sound localization and recognition. So it's definitely a promising direction for the future.
And finally, the last application is speech and language development in robot learning. How could this research help create robots that can understand and speak like humans?
This is one of the most ambitious applications. The idea is to use the auditory model as part of a robot's learning system.
Okay.
So just like a human baby learns language by listening to sounds, the robot could use the model to process its own vocalizations and the sounds around it. And over time, it could learn to distinguish different sounds and even start to form categories like phonemes, the basic building blocks of language.
So it would be like a robot learning language from scratch just by listening and interacting with its environment.
Exactly. And because the model is plastic, meaning it can change its connections over time, it could adapt to different accents and ways of speaking.
It's incredible to think about a robot developing its own language skills in a way that's similar to how humans do.
It really is a fascinating area of research, and it has huge implications for the future of artificial intelligence.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground here. But to sum up, this path forward for the macaque auditory model is all about increasing biological realism, getting more specific data, validating the model at multiple scales, and developing more efficient methods to handle the growing complexity. And the potential applications are mind-blowing, from BCIs to tinnitus therapies to robots that can understand and speak like humans.
It's a testament to the power of this kind of detailed, data-driven modeling. It's not just about understanding the brain for the sake of understanding. It's about translating that knowledge into real-world applications that can improve people's lives.
And that's what it's all about, right? So to everyone listening, I encourage you to think about the implications of this research. What does it mean to have a model that accurately simulates how our brains process sound? How might that change the way we think about hearing, communication, and even consciousness? It's a question worth pondering.
I completely agree. And as this research progresses, I think we're going to see even more incredible breakthroughs that we can't even imagine yet. It's an exciting time to be following the field of neuroscience.